I'm a brilliant intellectual.
As am I.
The two of us are sick of dealing with troglodytes, and so we moved into a bomb shelter so we wouldn't catch the stupid.
Now we pass our intelligence on by debunking YouTube videos.
We are
The Debunkers.
In war towns all over the United States, women are called upon to leave their homes and take jobs.
Women in the workforce?
Yes, war calls for many horrendous things.
During World War II, nearly 1 in 3 American men went off to war, and women were expected to take their place at work.
Note, they did not take men's place on the battlefield, because even though desperate times called for desperate measures, they still recognized distinct reason-based gender roles were paramount, and that women and men can't simply be replaced by one another.
They discover that factory work is usually no more difficult than housework.
No more difficult than housework?
Ah, yes, of course, because 75,000 people were deadly or permanently and totally disabled between 1942 and 1945 in household accidents.
No, wait, those were industrial accidents.
Ah, so industrial work was far more difficult and dangerous for women than household work. Who could have imagined?
Isn't this pretty hot for you?
Well, I hear it gets kind of hot around the kitchen stove, too.
A tough 1940s woman saying something to downplay the safety concerns and difficulty surrounding her job doesn't mean it wasn't difficult or was safe.
Also, please do not compare this brave woman to the working women who lefties promote today.
Hot office? It gets hot around a stove, too.
Air conditioning is sexist.
But the problem was, who was going to watch Rosie the Riveter's kids?
When married women with small children have to take jobs, everything possible will be done to provide day care for the children.
For 50 cents a day, which would be about $8 now, mothers could leave their kids at a government-funded daycare center.
Wow, well, children being raised by complete strangers at daycare centers was something we did out of sheer necessity at one of the most desperate points in global history, so it's probably a good and cool thing that we should keep doing forever now.
And not to be pedantic, but it's not $8 in today's money. It's closer to 10. Thanks, Joe Biden.
Lunch was included.
Once again, this was part of a war effort, not a feel-good progressive agenda. The nations which established childcare programs were predominantly those involved in the Second World War, the USSR being one of the biggest players.
This was never intended to be a long-term solution. It had to occur because, by and large, the family structure was no longer intact due to fathers leaving the household to fight in the war. It was a crutch for the broken family. Not a better option. Like emergency rations when food runs out. The idea is to return to a nutritious diet as soon as possible.
Unfortunately, to Vox, the goal wasn't to eventually leave the system behind and return to the family, but to leave the family behind and return to this system.
America actually set up universal childcare for working mothers. Canada and other countries did too. Around 500,000 American children attended these centers.
What is their source here?
Our figures show the U.S. National Child Care Service cared for only 139,000 children at its peak, despite the large number of mothers in the workforce. If you divide 500,000 by the 2,200 daycare centers, that's 200 kids at each daycare center, which isn't impossible, but seems like a stretch.
But when the war ended,
things returned to normal and children were raised by their parents again.
Joy is unconfined.
So did the daycare. Families protested, calling for the centers to be permanent, but the federal funding stopped in 1946.
Well, yes, because the war ended.
The need for a total war economy no longer existed. That's not an injustice. It's a good thing. These freaks saw the family structure being subverted by total warfare and were like, oh man, I'm so sad that that ended.
Do you think women should have needlessly stayed in those dangerous jobs while their children were raised by someone else? Oh, what am I asking? Of course she does!
What's so insidious about this is that it was at a time where it was still the status quo for a single breadwinner to earn the income for a family. There was absolutely no reason to accommodate mothers leaving the home. It would literally do nothing but take them from their children to line some industrial factory owner's pockets. And you're lamenting that it wasn't made more possible by the post-war government.
And so the US missed that start to begin a climb towards other childcare policies.
I think you missed the start of the video, where it was clear that universal childcare was part of the war effort and not a progressive agenda. It's obsolete unless your goal is to destroy the family.
So I get why you like it, but come on, try to frame this more honestly.
Other countries didn't. Canada had the same protest, and some provinces decided to keep their centers open.
Very foolishly indeed.
That decision started them down a path where it was easy to implement other government-run policies.
Other wonderful policies which usurped the role of the family, the fundamental building block of human civilization.
Exactly. We're supposed to take for granted that this Canadian method of doing things is superior, but for what reason would we ever assume that?
We shouldn't. And in fact, there's good data to help us reach the opposite conclusion. In 1997, Quebec launched full-day, year-round childcare for all kids under the age of 5. The title of its policy brief read, "Children at the Heart of Our Choice," but in French. Gross.
The assumption, of course, was that such a program would give children a leg up while enabling many more mothers to enter the workforce and make that cash money.
But within 10 years, various different analyses proved this was far from true. Social development among children, as indicated by both emotional and behavioral measures, had significantly deteriorated in Quebec relative to the rest of Canada.
10% of a standard deviation lower.
In fact, according to other figures, by age 4.5, extensive hours in daycare predicted negative social outcomes in every area, including social competence, externalizing problems, and adult-child conflict, generally at a rate 3 times higher than other children.
And analyses of self-reported general health and life satisfaction indicated that negative social-emotional outcomes associated with exposure to the daycare program persisted into young adulthood.
And in some cases, these negative effects became even stronger over time, as indicated by a 24% of a standard deviation increase in anxiety, a 19% increase in aggression, and a 13% increase in hyperactivity. The impact on boys and children with the most elevated behavior problems was stronger, especially in measures of hyperactivity and aggression.
This information is largely consistent with findings from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development's comprehensive evaluation of daycare in the U.S., which found that extensive hours in daycare in early life predicted negative behavioral outcomes throughout development, including in the final assessments done when the children were 15 years old. Family economic status, maternal education, quality of childcare, and caregiver closeness did not moderate these effects.
Perhaps a bit of an info dump, so to put it more briefly, the US did technically miss out, in the same sense that somebody who dodges a bullet does.
Though I am curious to know, what do behavioral problems in Canada look like?
Slightly less polite?
So, how did the US end up here? Here are some of the richest countries in the world. And here's when each of them established a paid maternity leave policy.
If it's what rich people are doing, it must be a good idea.
And a universal childcare policy. And let's throw in paid paternity leave for good measure. In France, they've actually had some form of universal childcare since the 1800s, but formalized the system in 1945.
And you know what they say? Always emulate the people who you had to save in both world wars.
Sweden, considered to have one of the best systems in the world, they were the first to guarantee paid paternity leave, and they've provided full childcare for all children since 1985.
Once again we encounter the myth of the Nordic socialist utopias.
These are never apples-to-apples comparisons, so let's point out some of the major differences between Sweden and the US.
Sweden has a population which is around 3% of America's, and 87% of their population lives within just 1.5% of the entire land area. They also have a highly centralized government. In other words, even if we wanted to adopt their system, we couldn't. But we shouldn't want to. Here's why.
Sweden has the highest maternal employment rate in the world at 83%. And according to Carolyn Hoagland, Secretary of the European Federation of Parents and Caregivers, quote, "Childcare started as a widening of choices, and now it is seen as the only socially acceptable choice. So the developmental childcare was a way for mothers and fathers to be able to work outside the home to raise GDP. Nearly all children in Sweden are enrolled in preschool starting at 12 to 18 months. The norm to do exactly that has become very strong. Staying at home with your child longer than the norm of about a year is not only difficult financially, but socially as well. She goes on to describe how people who want to stay with their children longer than that are often chastised for not contributing to society.
That's right. Because of this wonderfully utopian childcare system, children are enrolled in an early preschool system at 12 to 18 months, and staying home with your child for anything over than that year or so is extremely difficult. That's a hellscape. A creepy, dystopian, bizarre, heartless, icy hellscape.
Gotta love when one of the richest nations in the world prioritizes turning women into an economic unit rather than allowing them to be mothers, and the warm socialist utopians of the US want to encourage us to emulate this.
I want to be clear. Stripping children from their mothers when they're barely a year old isn't a quirky or different policy position we should be open-minded about or even discussing. It's evil. Sweden's childcare system sucks. They should be ashamed. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And now a quick word from our sponsor. You know, the same kinds of people making the bogus claims we're debunking happen to write a lot of the news you consume.
How could you avoid the fate of being trapped in their web of misinformation?
With Ground News! Are you fat and ugly and bitter and bad at deciphering media bias?
Ground News can help you solve one of those problems.
It'll make you skinnier? Oh.
Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform. It allows you to sort through different news stories and see how the left reports on things as opposed to the right, making you a fact-checking whiz.
You'll definitely want to check out the blind spot feature. It's an extremely useful tool that shows you specific stories that have gone underreported by the left or right.
Like this story on how 41% of small businesses can't pay rent this month.
If you scroll down a little further, you can see each of the news outlets that have reported on the story, as well as each of the sources' headlines and their political bias rating.
You may be your mother's least favorite child, but at least now you have the opportunity to own her golden boy with facts and logic next time you're home for the holidays.
Speaking of the holidays, Ground News is still running their Black Friday sale. To get 40% off a Vantage subscription, go to ground.news/freedomtunes by December 2nd. That's ground.news/freedomtunes. TOONS.
Now back to the debunking.
You'll notice the US has none of these policies. Technically, there is a 12-week maternity leave policy, it's just not paid. That's up to your employer. And a few states offer preschool, and there are some childcare programs, but they're mostly for low-income families and far from universal.
For whom else should it be? Who on earth would we expect to want to leave their children with complete strangers other than those who are too destitute to have any other option?
Also, this is dishonest framing. While all EU member nations provide support to reduce the cost of childcare for children below school age, they do so to varying degrees and with different policy mixes.
Childcare in the US right now is very fragmented.
Well, in a nation of 330 million people living across 50 states, I don't know what else you would expect it to be.
There are different programs that function for different purposes and often work against each other.
Take a closer look at this chart. After World War II was a popular time for these childcare policies, but so was the 70s.
Ah, yes. When did we ever make clearer decisions as a civilization than directly after World War II and during the 70s?
The early 70s were a time for women's rights.
Women's rights is the PR term the sexual revolution landed on for convincing women to participate in their own debasement.
Equal employment laws had just passed, divorce laws were loosened,
Told ya.
and many countries established universal childcare policies.
Because, once again, the West was entrenched in civilization-destroying warfare. This time, the sexual revolution, which left the family destroyed in a way far more drastic and irreversible than any weapon of the Second World War could have. And this time, universal childcare systems were placed there not to pick up the pieces of a broken family structure they were hoping to repair, but to blow a more functioning family structure into millions of little pieces.
It almost happened in the US, too. Almost.
What happened in 1971 is there was obviously a sense that we needed to do something about childcare.
We had to do something about childcare. that thing humans had a perfect method of handling for literally all of history up until that point.
You don't understand. We had to invent the wheel. It had never been invented before.
And Congress actually acted. Both the House and the Senate passed the Comprehensive Child Development Act.
This was a really extraordinary bill because it would have provided universal child care. It would not have been stigmatized in the same way that welfare programs would have been. It would have been available to a much wider group of families.
But then, President Richard Nixon vetoed it.
No one expected the veto. A terrible shock.
If Brexit or 2016 or anything else that they were blindsided by is any indication, no one expected the veto most likely means we didn't expect the veto, but everyone in touch with what the common person wants could have seen it coming a mile away.
His veto message said that this is going to create communal childcare. It would Sovietize the American family.
All very good points.
I love how every time anti-communism is given as a reason for doing something, the left responds as if communism literally just never existed and was invented by evil Republicans to have more excuses to be mean. This was during the 1970s. Communism was a pretty significant existential threat. It still is. But it really was then.
Communists were in control of one of the largest nations in the world and had actual nukes.
And they didn't suffer from dementia like today's communist leader who's in charge of a massive nation and has access to nukes.
That language was a response to criticism that he was going soft on communism, like by visiting China.
Here's the part where we don't refute his argument, but try instead to find motivations for him to have made it which have nothing to do with the topic being discussed.
But really,
the right wing began to see this as an encroachment because it could be used potentially by white middle-class families in order to support women leaving the home and going out into the workforce.
Yes, that's what he said. Communism.
Because it could be used potentially by white middle-class families in order to support women leaving the home and going out into the workforce.
No, that's not what it could do. That's its express purpose, and the entire reason why you support it.
They're not supposed to be working.
No, they aren't. And all of the data make that perfectly clear. Daycare is absolutely horrible for children, but rather than confronting the fact that your reinvention of the wheel does nothing but hurt children, you cling to your outdated egalitarian fantasies and assume the rest of us should take them for granted as well, when they've brought nothing but harm and destruction to the most vulnerable among us.
Exactly. Daycare produces less socially well-adjusted children than homes where they're with their mother. Explain to me why mothers should be out working when we know this is the case, without chortling about how knowing anything about what the data says makes one a retrograde chauvinist.
We do want to make, poor Black and brown Indigenous mothers like...
What?
Okay, she's just writing fanfic at this point.
President Nixon, there are zero flaws with daycare. We should universalize it.
Absolutely not. I hate Indigenous women too much.
She doesn't have an argument for why daycare is an acceptable place to abandon your child at for the entire day when you have any other option. So not only does she need to resort to calling us sexist for disagreeing with her, she pulls out the big guns and says we're racist too.
Can I ask a genuine question to this woman? If you ever happen to watch this, how many of my policy positions on a day-to-day basis do you think I go about defining based on a hatred for Indigenous women? Like, what place in my head do you think that occupies? Do you think I'm, going around hearing about the issues and going, I could pick this side, but then what kind of hatred for Indigenous women would I be expressing?
Those are the non-deserving kinds of mothers that shouldn't be on welfare. They should be working.
How can she be this obtuse? The conservative argument isn't that black mothers should be working and white ones shouldn't. In fact, it's no argument at all. It's a simple statement of basic fact. Men should provide for their wives and children. And a system which does anything to usurp that role is a broken one.
She doesn't cite a single source for any of her radical claims, though that shouldn't be a shock, because if she was big into the whole having sources thing, she wouldn't be in favor of daycare in the first place.
No. None of those studies matter. For you see, we've been called racist.
Ah, yes. I thought I believed daycare was bad because by every metric it leads to worse outcomes for children, but it turns out I just hate those Cherokee women so much.
I not to harp on this too much, right? But I love when people say, actually, it was racism, smugly, as if they've, like, proven anything. Look at the way she says that. Like, she's just, like, weaved this grand narrative and surprised us with the plot twist. How smug. You didn't make a point. It's a standard left-wing throat clearing. Everything's racist.
Conservative Phyllis Schlafly led that opposition.
Based.
Women whose husbands have left them or divorced them or whatever have a very hard time. But when you look at these wives who simply want a standard of living higher than their husband is producing, crying around that they want somebody else to pay for their daycare.
Yes, exactly. Literally. That's completely true.
They were organizing against childcare because it would take mothers out of the home.
And it would take children out of the homes as well, correct? A federalized and Huxleyan system of child rearing actually isn't a good thing.
Just as the European countries were starting their childcare systems, we were shutting the door.
The day after Nixon vetoes the CDA, he signs into law a bill that created childcare tax deductions for middle-class and affluent families.
Yes, to make universal childcare less of a necessity by lowering the tax burden for families so more of them could afford to have the mother stay at home. That's an absolutely flawless step in the right direction. Smirking about it doesn't make it a bad idea.
Even if Vox plays cheeky music over her smirking?
Especially.
Is creates a two-tiered system. On one hand, you have these tax supports, and then on the other hand, you get these much more stigmatized direct supports for only low-income families.
Yes, because there's nothing wrong with having less money taken from you, but there is something potentially shameful about taking other people's money without their consent if you don't need it, or if it's because of irresponsible decision-making. Most folks are more interested in scrutinizing people who are taking money from them rather than those who are getting to keep more of their own money.
Meanwhile, these countries were able to follow a path from one universal policy to another. Experts call this path dependency. So for these countries, once they established one universal policy, creating others was fairly straightforward.
Yep, hard to stop a train wreck once it's started.
Where in the US, it's been easier to design policies within the parameters of the existing income-based programs or the tax breaks that Nixon founded.
He set a path where any kind of federal childcare policy would be as underfunded, stigmatized as possible.
Unlike the path you would like to put us down, where husbands supporting their wives and women staying home with their children is as stigmatized as possible.
It's a system that reinforces and deepens inequalities of race, gender, and class.
Incorrect.
Stable families transcend demographic disparity. Racial minorities and married couple households are significantly less likely to live in poverty. That's right, the family unit is so strong as an institution that it mitigates the effects of all the pervasive white supremacy under which we live. It's stronger than racism.
And yet, wanting to preserve the family by reducing financial strain that married couples with many children might experience in the form of tax cuts, and doing anything and everything necessary to keep the family unit contained rather than splitting it up through various childcare bureaucracies and places of employment, is merely a tactic of those who hate Indigenous women.
It doesn't end up helping so many of our families.
By helping families, she means helping to split them up, by the way.
But just because we're on that path doesn't mean we can't change.
Have mercy.
Just look at the United Kingdom.
From a bird's eye view, these countries are following very similar paths.
Neither continued the daycare centers after World War II. Both had attempted childcare policies in the 70s. The UK's failed attempt was actually led by conservative Margaret Thatcher. But in the 90s, the UK actually shifted and established a universal pre-K program. So what changed?
It's framed as education, not welfare.
as is the system in Sweden, where children are expected to be placed into the system at as early as 12 months, and where mothers are rarely able to stay with their children beyond that first year and a half, and when they are, it's deeply stigmatized.
And so those questions of deservingness aren't applicable in the same way because it's education for all children. It's part-time, it's not as generous, but I think that it is an example of how you can readjust your priorities and change direction.
The US had universal childcare once.
And my friend lived in a homeless shelter once. Does it mean that's a preferable alternative to what he can have when his life is on track? Similarly, a nation that isn't engaged in an all-encompassing war effort that forces women into dangerous factory jobs and is able to have normal and healthy functioning family units shouldn't opt instead for state centers where children are separated from their mothers for the majority of the day. In conclusion,
the underlying assumption of this video is that a system of strangers raising other people's children for them so that worker scarcity can be diminished is not only an acceptable thing for a normal, well-adjusted adult to want, but is in fact a preferable alternative to the family.
But all of the data, unsurprisingly, show this to be completely untrue.
Within 5 years of birth, 1/3 of children born to unmarried parents see their father less than once a month and are already showing problems in test performance and behavior.
Adolescents whose parents have divorced are more likely to experience injury, accidents, and illness than children from intact families.
Furthermore, stable families transcend demographic disparity. Racial minorities in married couple households are significantly less likely to live in poverty. That's right, meaning the family's the best thing for battling white supremacy.
Families matter more than the state ever will. No government will ever raise a child better than a loving family, and federal funding to childcare programs is a crutch. It's a wooden leg to use if somebody has lost theirs. Not something we should all be going to get cosmetic surgery to replace our healthy and functioning legs with.
And almost did again. But with policy, it's never really game over.
Believe me, if those policies usurp the role of the family, it will be.